So, everybody, panelists, smile. Okay, all right, here we go. Welcome. Well, hey, we had such a fantastic time with Allison at the third annual Energy for Sales Summit. Many of you joined that, and she took us into a journey, into a conversation that was delightful, fun. Allison, I was shocked by how many people took you up on the offer for the Echo profile, the assessment. So that was fun. And
Yeah.
because of that, obviously coming out of Summit, we decided we're going to do a live podcast once a month. I reached out to you pretty short notice, honestly, and said,
Yeah.
hey, we had such a tremendous response of people saying, oh my gosh, like the four listening profiles, this assessment came back to me and it was me to the T. And I mean, my wife took it. I mean, it's been fun. So you graciously agreed to come back on a Friday, October the 13th, Friday the
My
13th. Here we
favorite day of the
are.
year.
Here we are. And Halloween right around the corner. I mean,
Yeah.
spooky month. And here's the thing about spooky month, it's spooky how many conversations in sales aren't really good conversations. And I was challenged when you said that sales is simply the culmination of a really good conversation. That was what I took away from the summit. So I'm excited to have you back. I'm going to stop talking and let you say a few words to the folks joining us today on this live podcast.
Okay. Well, thank you so much again for reaching out and inviting me to come back. Super excited to jump into this. I have a really ambitious amount of content to share with you. So we're just
Yeah,
going to see how it goes. And if, we come up against our time deadline, we'll punt and maybe connect again. But I figure
absolutely.
we should probably just dive in. Yeah.
Yeah, let's go for it. David, I don't know if you want to say a
Okay.
few words. I know you're listening, you are geared up, ready. I know you and I are going to go into a live podcast to answer some questions at the end of this. But why don't you say a few words and then let's as
Yeah,
Allison shares her screen.
just excited and blessed to have Allison back. Our session and my assessment was spot on, transformational. I'm sure she will get into, like, once you find out what it is and what are you going to go do about it. A lot of our conversation after my assessment came out was around that, and learned some really cool things that's helping me in scripting and to not lose certain types of listeners. So just excited. It's Friday afternoon, Friday the 13th. Love to learn.
Let's
Can't wait
go.
to see Allison. Yeah.
Let's do it. Okay, so many of you have already completed the assessment. So if you have, go ahead and grab your profile and keep it handy. If you haven't yet, you'll have an opportunity to do that as well. But I'm going to ask you a question before we even start, or I'm going to give you something to think about. I'll say it that way. I want you to think about yourself in conversation. What are the conversations and with whom do you find it easiest to listen to and to stay engaged in the conversation? Meaning it's comfortable. It doesn't cost you a lot of energy to stay in that conversation. Now, here's the flip side. I want you to also to think about the situations that really challenge you. What are the conversations like, and who are the people involved that tax you of your energy? It's challenging to stay engaged, either with the content or with the people. Maybe you even find yourself frustrated or impatient or checking out. So, is there a specific workplace communication situation or conversation that really challenges you? Maybe it's a weekly meeting, a particular client. So just keep a mental note of that. And we're going to come back to that. But this is what we're out to achieve today. It's why I'm here. It's as simple as this. My goal is that you walk away from today with a few tips and tricks and a framework to use your listening to have more meaningful and valuable sales oriented conversations. Listening, like any skill, if we apply really intentional practice, we can hone it. We can have better conversations if we get present and focus and are willing to shift and adapt to the circumstances that we're in and the people that we're in conversation with. And that right there is this concept that I want to introduce you to, which is listening intelligence. So what is it? It has 3 components. The first is understanding how you listen. That's self-awareness. The second piece of listening intelligence is recognizing how others listen, meaning connecting to our conversational partners. What is important to them in terms of the lenses and the information that they tend to pick up on. And then the third part is adapting what you say or how you speak in order to be heard in the way that you intend. Okay? So listening intelligence is an agility that we can develop over time to have more valuable conversations with anyone about anything. So here's the thing. How does that apply to sales? As sales professionals, we have to be malleable. We have to be able to adjust on the spot in real time to diverse circumstances, different people with different needs, but most important, we have to be self-aware. We have to be willing to be present and to shift. Anyone like stats? I can't see anyone to raise their hand, but there are some pretty, Stephen, thank you for raising your hand. I love that you love stats also. There are actually some pretty disturbing statistics around this disconnect between sales professionals and buyers when it comes to sales professionals' intentions or how they see themselves and buyers' perceptions of salespeople. So let's look at this. This is from a HubSpot research. Check it out. The blue bar represents the salesperson's perception of themselves, and the orange is the buyer's perception of the salesperson. I don't multitask well, so I will not be managing chat, but Tim and David, if people chat in here, feel free to interrupt me as I'm going.
Yeah, and I just dropped this in the chat, but if you're listening, please use the chat. Drop questions in here for Allison in real time. Go for it.
Yeah. Yep. There are 2 stats here that I really want to draw attention to. The second one, listening to my prospects' needs, and the 5th one, Taylor's pitch based on customers' needs. There's a 21% and a 34% discrepancy, respectively, between what the salesperson believes that they are doing or how they're showing up and what the buyer's perception of that interaction is, right? So we as salespeople, we might believe we are listening intently because we have really good intentions to connect with our buyer. But if our buyer doesn't walk away with the perception of us as a quality listener, we've missed the mark, right? There's one additional stat that I want to mention that came up in the study, but I don't think it's on this this slide. It's what buyers say makes a positive experience. 69% of buyers wish the salesperson listened to their needs. So that means they perceive that we are not. So that said, clearly having a prepared pitch is an antiquated approach to sales. And that's often what we do, right? But buyers are way too savvy. They want to be heard, they want to be understood, and they want sales professionals to adapt to them and hear and listen to their needs. And that's where listening intelligence becomes so critically important. So I want to ask you this. How do you feel about sales, quote unquote, sales, and the perception of salespeople? So Yeah, right. I know it's a little uncomfortable and cringy because, if I had a dollar for every time I heard, I hate sales, or I don't want to sell, or I can't stand salespeople, right? I'd have a second home in the mountains and a much nicer car than I do. We know that, this reputation of salespeople is that we're pushy, that, we're salesy. Do you think that makes us resistant to having sales conversations?
Yeah.
That perception of ourselves and, what we believe is the perception of others, right? Does it make us resistant to, yeah, I agree, Tim. I think sometimes we think about that before we pick up the phone or before we enter the conversation. So here's the thing. If we're afraid of how we'll be perceived, or we believe sales is about coercion or convincing someone, that's a fundamental issue and 100% will get in the way of a meaningful conversation.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
When we enter a conversation with that mindset, we have primed our brain for threat. And when our brain perceives a threat, I call that amygdala hijack, right? Our listening shuts down, and then we're at a huge disadvantage, right? So, one of the other reasons we're resistant in sales conversations is we are taught often in sales training to be ready to overcome objections, right? To turn a no into a yes. So fundamentally, right there's a negative connotation around coercion. Right? So our brain is going to perceive that conversation as threat. So, okay, how do we do it? How do we have a really, really good conversation, especially when we feel pressure or fear, or we need to hit quotas, for example?
Right away, I just love what you're saying here, is that pressure immediately. And that's what I think the huge light bulb moment is. It's hijacking my ability to listen, the pressure. So yes. How do we as sales professionals build a filter to take corporate pressure or a managerial pressure or even our own internal ambition and that pressure, and filter that so we can show up fully present? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow.
You just said that, Tim, the fully present, it's all about mindset. It's in this conversation right here. Aside from everything else, can I eliminate the distractions that prevent me from showing up with this intention to learn?
Yeah. And as sales leaders, we continue to coach our people to push the pressures as far back as possible, but we normally just leave it there. Now,
right.
We're both proponents, Tim and I think the best way to come across naturally and not press is having the biggest active true pipeline, so that you're not dependent on any one, the pressure of I have to go get that one. But it's hard to create that all the time. But that's the goal. I've seen that in action. If you have a big bustling active pipeline, you have the confidence, you hit your number by October, you're going to have a great Q4. You're going to be relaxed. You're going to be more natural. You're going to be more open for listening and having those organic outcomes of a good conversation. So,
yeah. I mean, this right here, if anyone attended, if anyone's on the call right now that was that attended the sales summit, you heard me say this.
Yeah.
But I believe that a sale is what happens when needs are met. It's less about pitch or preparing a presentation. It's more about asking really, really great open-ended questions to gain insight, deep insight into what's important to that other person. So a sale is the natural, organic outcome of a really good conversation grounded in listening. So here's the thing. People think asking questions is the most critical piece of this. Yes, and it starts with one really good open-ended question, but we have to be solid in our intention to listen in order to ask the next open-ended question that will provide even more insight. So it's really listening. Quality listening is at the core of being able to ask really good questions, right? So it requires showing up with a deep desire to learn. Mm-hmm. And it's also about service and a desire to provide value. Okay. Here's the fundamental concept that is an absolute game changer when it comes to successful sales conversations. Okay. We all listen differently. So every single person on the other end of that conversation that you are, quote unquote, selling to has a different, unique way that they are filtering information. Most of us recognize that individuals express themselves in unique ways, right? Recent research shows the same is true for listening. So I'm going to ask you a question. Have you ever, David, Tim, anyone else that's on the call, have you ever attended a meeting or had a conversation? Maybe it's high stakes, maybe it's not. And then discovered afterwards that everyone involved walked away with a kind of a different impression or different takeaway from what was said? Yes. This second bullet point is why, right? Listening is a brain-based activity, and since no two brains are the same, no two people hear the same information in the exact same way. So if we have different priorities, cares, concerns, and we don't pause or slow down, confirm, and align on that, what could happen? Right? So think about what are the implications if you have certain cares and concerns in a conversation, but your prospect or your buyer has very different cares and concerns, and those aren't surfaced. You could be taking away very different things from that exact same conversation. Right? So I like to say we listen with our, we hear with our ears, but we listen with our brain. Right? So you think about people picking up on different things in the same conversation. There's a huge potential for missing critically important information that could influence how you craft and adapt your message to your audience, or in this case, your buyer. Yeah. This is really important. And this is the basis for where we're going with the listening profile and what we learn from it. So fundamental concept is that listening is a habit. Habits are formed over time. Usually they develop because they serve us in some way. And sometimes they really do serve us, and then sometimes not as much. The latest research in listening shows that we habitually listen for certain types of information while filtering out other input. This is, again, where listening intelligence comes into play. And what's so critically important in sales is to be self-aware and adaptable, and to really know our habits and our preferences. Because then if we know our habits, we know our default, we can shift when the circumstances call for it. And this is really the fundamental principle of the assessment that many of you have already taken. We're going to talk briefly about ECHO and where it falls into the general landscape of assessments, and then we'll dive into the model itself. But just really quickly, here's what the assessment landscape looks like. They typically fall into three distinct categories or buckets: personality, behavioral, and cognitive. So personality and behavioral assessments, they measure traits that are more or less fixed or hardwired in us. So if we were to change jobs or occupations or engage with different people, the personality and behaviors will most likely stay the same. Now, cognitive assessments measure an individual's preferences based on how they process information. So ECHO falls into this bucket, the cognitive bucket, and specifically measures for what types of information we prefer to listen to and for, and then what we might unintentionally filter out or miss. ECHO is a scientifically validated assessment tool. Okay, so it's been through that rigorous process. We can trust it. And it characterized listening into 4 habits. We all use a blend of all 4. It's just to different levels, or as I like to say, preference or bias. So this is really important. ECHO does not identify who you are, but rather the habits you've come to rely on in communication, specifically in listening. The way we listen influences the way we share information. So knowing what it is we pay attention to is really important when we're thinking about how we might need to adapt how we speak or share information. So let's look at the 4 habits that were identified in the research. And if there are any questions, comments, concerns you want to bring up now, Tim, David, please jump in. Don't ever hesitate to interrupt me.
Absolutely.
Okay. So normally we think of listening as someone's either listening or they're not. Or we think someone's a good listener or a bad listener. I don't think that is a productive way to think about listening, knowing the science around it. A better question is the way that I habitually listen and how I'm listening right now in this moment, in this conversation, is this supporting or hindering the desired outcome of the interaction or this meeting, right? So that's the question that we want to think about and get present with. And that's the first part of listening intelligence, right? This self-awareness piece. Is the way that I habitually listen and how I'm listening right now supporting or hindering the desired outcome of this conversation? So that's the mindset shift, okay? So now I'm going to give you a high-level description of each of the habits, a little nuance of how you might experience it in your own listening or identify it in someone else. And when I describe each one, I'm going to talk about it as if it's expressed in its purest, most archetypical form. So remember, or note, I should say, some listeners can be single dominant in one habit. Some are a combination of more than one and sometimes even non-dominant in their listening. So let's start with connective. So take note of the icon. You see the arrows pointing outward? That is indicating that this is an external lens, okay? So connective listening focuses on how the information impacts others versus how it impacts that individual personally. These are listeners who tend to be highly sensitive to subtle cues expressed by others. So they'll pick up on what they perceive the feeling in the room is, or the tone. They tend to be caretakers of others in conversation. So they're caretaking the people involved in the interaction more than focused on the data and the details themselves. These are listeners who will tend to tune out if there isn't a human component to the conversation or there isn't an impact on people that's being discussed. Okay, so that's very high level. So let's talk reflective. And again, check out the icon. This is a very different lens. This is an internal lens. So those arrows are pointing inward. So in contrast to that external, the reflective listener filters through the lens of their own experience, their expertise, their self-interest, how the information impacts them personally and their job. And I want to make sure that I really stress here, this is not a selfish person, because selfishness, that's more of a personality trait, right? Echo doesn't identify who we are or hardwired personality traits, okay? This is a listener who has a very deep database of experience that they're connecting what they hear to what they already know or what they're interested in. So if they don't see personal relevance, they might tend to tune out or stop listening. They prefer to take time to process before sharing. There's a flip side to this. If they make a very quick connection to their deep personal database, they may have no problem whatsoever telling you exactly what they think, and they will share their experience as if it is a universal experience. But these are often our listeners who are really misunderstood because they do like that time to process, and they might not share a whole lot in a meeting. We'll talk about how they can throw us off as salespeople if they are a prospect or a buyer, and we'll get there. Okay. So our analytical listeners, our graph in the icon depicts that these are folks who are really oriented towards facts and data that is proven and accurate and can be sourced and is true. These are folks that might overlook feelings in favor of information. So they can lose patience and tune out when people present ideas that aren't backed up with facts, or an idea seems to kind of come out of left field and isn't grounded in what is. So these are also listeners who tend to be misunderstood. And much of that is the way that they ask questions or the way they share informations or make statements. These are not listeners who are caretakers in conversation. This can really throw you off as their conversational partners, because they will ask you questions like, where'd you get that data? How can we trust this? That's not true. So things like that will give us the impression that they are challenging the credibility of the speaker, when that's not it at all. It's not about the speaker. It's about the credibility of the information, and can we trust it and use it to get to the right outcome? Okay. So let's look at our final habit, which is conceptual listening. See the swirl? That's kind of depicting this swirl of thoughts, which is big picture and abstract ideas, non-linear listening. So these are listeners who don't tend to hear or see limitations, but they're all about the potentiality and the possibilities. They are idea generators who love to brainstorm, unhindered by any kind of structure or framework, right? So these tend to be our team members or our prospects that they'll come up with something and we think like, wow, where did that come from? Or they'll talk a lot in analogies. This is like this. They see those similarities or patterns, they hear them, and it's very easy to express them. So, are you starting to notice yourself in any of these, would be my question for everyone listening? Or do you notice other people you work with, or that, you know, your clients, your vendors? I want to make sure that I mention that every one of this listening habits has strengths and potential challenges for the individual, right? And that's because the listener's attention on certain information versus others, we're potentially neglecting or missing things in conversation, right? So the objective is to become really aware of how we habitually listen, our unique strengths and our potential challenges, and then begin to adapt our listening when needed. So Anything before we keep going?
Well, this is great. We have an anonymous question in the chat is what if you're a couple of them? And I think you're going to get to that because we all have a score. I'm going to offer myself up here. I rank very highly in the conceptual listening category. And Allison, you guessed it from our first interaction ever because of just some of the cues you picked up in. Now, one thing I'll ask you, because I really want to know this, is do you find different types of people generally falling into more of a higher score here? Like, so for instance, a business owner, a leader, somebody at the helm of the company, again, to get to that point, to take a company from, an idea to a reality, that's a lot of conceptual. Do you find that different personas fit, like analytical might be more of your financial people, the CFOs, do you find different positions fitting within a higher score in certain of these four?
Such a great habit. Such a great question, Tim. Yes. And so we don't have scientific data that says if you are a CEO of a startup, right, you are this percentage likely to be this habit in your listening preferences. Anecdotally, what we know from thousands of participants, thousands of people completing this assessment, we definitely see trends. So to that question of the CEO of a startup, more often than not, we see those individuals as highly conceptual in their listening. These are folks who are not seeing limitations. They are willing to take risks. They are really oriented towards possibilities, potentiality, and aren't necessarily dismayed if they have to change the course of action midstream. We definitely see trends with people in engineering roles, in software development, like you said, the CFOs definitely see higher percentage of those individuals with more analytical listening and sometimes reflective in their profile. So can we pinpoint if you are this type of listener, you will tend to be, in this particular role? Not necessarily, but we see trends anecdotally for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. I do like how the icon, I like how all your icons give on it. This one kind of reminds me of a tornado. And
can you relate to that in your listening sometimes?
Anyway, David, I'm sorry.
I knew you would
10 years of
hurricanes. It all made sense. It all made sense.
So if you have completed the assessment, this page is page 4 in the profile report. It's one of 22 pages in the very robust profile report. This word at the top, in this case, the brainstormer, this descriptor word. So it's not a label, but it's a word that tells a story about the listening for someone with this profile. And I love the word associated with the profile because when even if you just read the word, you get a sense of what is the listening style of someone with this type of profile. We all use all 4 habits when listening, just to different degrees. So the numbers at the bottom add up to 100. The highest score you can get in any one habit is a 40. The lowest you can get is a 10. And what we look at in this bar graph is the relationship between the habits and those numbers inside of the individual profile. So if you are listening to this and you've got, a really good friend in your company and you're comparing your numbers for connective listening to one another, that's an unfair comparison. That's like comparing apples and noodles, for example. So really the relevance is only inside of the individual bar graph. Okay. we're not going to go deeply into this right now, into individual interpretation. But what I'm going to encourage you is to spend some time reading through this page later. Read through your descriptor paragraph. Does that resonate with you? Read through your strengths and possible challenges, and really study it, as self-awareness is this first and most critical component of developing our listening intelligence. We start there, and then we work on identifying or recognizing preferences of others. Okay, so first step, self-awareness. Then we can start to recognize and identify our conversational partners. So let's talk about that. How do we begin to identify and draw some conclusions about preferences and what's important to other people? Okay. So one way is to clue into someone's, their body language, to observe their body language. You've got a document in the resources that I threw into the chat at the very top of the chat. This is one of them. And it's some broad generalizations about body language that's typically associated with each of the different habits. Note, these examples in here, they may not always be relevant or accurate, especially with different cultures. But these are some broad generalizations that can show us what type of listener we might be in conversation with. But here's the thing, body language is tricky. Have you ever misread someone's body language or been misunderstood? Yeah. So let's talk about the relationship between body language and listening. We create a lot of assumptions about others based on what we observe or perceive in their body language. So the flip side is that we're often really unaware of the cues and signals we're giving off and how others are perceiving us in our body language. What Echo teaches us is that body language is just one piece of the puzzle, and our assumptions about other people's body language are often inaccurate. So all four habits tend to display kind of distinct physical manifestations, right? So we can start to identify people's habits by what we observe in their body language, but this is critical. We cannot see into someone else's brain, so we cannot have an accurate sense of whether or not someone is engaged in listening. Okay? We might be able to identify the type of listener, but not whether or not they are actually engaged and listening. So let's talk about some of those cues, but it's just a piece of the puzzle. So here, we've got a connective listener. This is someone who really appears to be listening attentively, right? There's eye contact. They're leaning in. They look like they're in it with the speaker, right? This is typical body language for someone who's highly connective. So here's the thing though, active listening, if anyone's done any kind of listening training, typically what they teach is active listening, right? So show that you're listening by having eye contact, leaning in. So when we see this type of body language, we believe someone is really engaged in what we're sharing with them. Again, we can't see into someone's cognitive process. We can't tell with visual cues whether or not someone's really taking in what we're sharing with them. Right? Here's another question. Have you ever shown up with this type of body language and then realized, holy cow, I have no idea what they're talking about. I've missed important details potentially. And you really recognize that you haven't been actively engaged. So don't get co-opted. This is what I want to stress. Don't get co-opted by a buyer who you perceive you've really connected with, based on their body language.
Allison, I want to interject real quick because I mean, connective is my second highest score. And as a speaker, I know how it is to see those faces, that energy from the crowd. And so when I'm listening, often I will want to show up with a smile on my face and what I found was sometimes some of my energy is going more towards that and how I'm showing up than it is to listening. Something I learned early on in sales was don't stand cross-armed because you look closed off. However, as a high conceptual connective person, when I actually cross my arms and do this, I'm bringing my body into subordination, so I don't reach for things, so I don't grab. So I'm actually listening better when I'm crossed. And when I was younger in sales, I misread that because I had read, don't cross your arms, be open, and that's maybe a good habit for sales and an approach and being open in a conversation. However, I misread that when I was calling on maybe a technical or somebody and they were closed armed, and I thought, oh, they're not really into this. So I was co-opted. So I love that you say that. For me, this means I'm in, like I'm listening. I'm not.
So you're bringing up a really, really important concept, Tim, which is that our body language is often different when we're speaking than when we're listening. So if I'm highly conceptual, when I'm speaking, I might be using big hand gestures, right? But when I'm listening, I might need to contain that in order to really be able to focus on the content that's being shared. And I might need to be a little bit more still in my body language. But bottom line is, if we are presenting or we are a salesperson and we're really using body language as our indicator of level of engagement or interest in our product, we could be really missing something.
Wow.
And so that's where this comes into play, our reflective listener. So these are folks who can really throw us off in sales. They're very misunderstood at times, very misperceived. They have so much internal dialogue going on that often isn't being shared. And in their body language, they appear to be checked out, even if they could be deeply connected to what's being said. And so their eye contact is very limited. Their gaze is generally past the speaker or at the ceiling, maybe beyond the speaker. So this is someone in that sales conversation that may give you no feedback. They may not ask you questions. They're processing what you're saying in their own head. You may think, done, right? Like, that is not a sale for me. They are not interested. They could be very, very carefully thinking about what it is you're sharing and relating it to their experience and what they need personally. So again, if you get co-opted by body language and think, ugh, they're not interested, I'm going to cut this short, I've got a lot of work to do, right? On to the next. You might miss out on a great opportunity to meet their needs.
And I think, Allison, you had, in our conversation, you had, when we were talking about the reflective, because I'm that beautiful flexor.
Yeah.
That's everything. That the reflective is also taking in, how does this impact me? How does it impact my team, my family, my world? And so there is a lot going on. They are taking in the information, but there's a lot of processing of what's the impact.
It's really, it's really more personal impact. A single dominant, archetypical reflective listener is likely not thinking about the impact on their team or the impact on others. It's really more about, what do I know about this? How can I personally use this information to get my job done or to make a personal impact or contribution? So they're relating what they hear to their own circumstances. Again, not in a selfish way, but really just that's the framework, is how can I personally use this information, either for myself or to add a valuable contribution. So this is very typical body language for someone who's highly analytical. They have a lot of stillness in there and very little facial expression, although sometimes it's a furrowed brow when they're listening, because they are evaluating the information for merit. They are not swayed by charisma. So you're not going to get a whole lot of interaction that feels like rapport with someone who is highly analytical in their listening. But typically, hands somewhere around the face, the head, they will check out both in their listening, but also in their body language. Their body language might completely shift if the conversation is brainstorming, for example. If there isn't relevant data or information that's being shared, they might pull out a laptop and start working. And then our conceptual listener tends to have a lot of energy in their body language, fidgety at times, excitement, urgency. Again, since we can't see into someone's cognitive process, we can't see into someone's brain, we tend to rely on some of these observable cues. And it can be confusing because it can tell us what what their listening preferences are, but it's not definitive in terms of whether or not they're taking in what it is that we're saying or sharing with them. So more reliable than body language is actual language, word choices, questions asked, statements made. Okay. So let's look at that. Again, these are in your packet as well. So I encourage you to read through this later, but this is how we can start to identify our buyers based on the language that they're using. So I'm going to give you a couple of scenarios. So if you read through it, what kind of listener do you think that this is? Based on what I've shared with you high level. Is anything coming in through the chat, Tim or David?
I'm watching the chat and I don't want to jump in and answer because I want to see what comes in the chat. Feel free, guys. Use the chat. Jump in here. Guess. There you go.
Yes. Yes, exactly. It's concern for people. Speaks to the human component, the impact on the team, the impact on people versus metrics or logistics.
Yeah.
Right. So for connective listeners that are our prospects, we want to understand what it means for the people in the day-to-day, boots on the ground, right? How our offering can make an impact for people. And that's what we want to speak to for our connective buyers. How about this?
Let's read it here. Use the chat, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Reflective.
Yes. It's a really good example, again, of how body language is often different when listening versus speaking. So looks like this gentleman is really, sharing like, trust me, with authority, right? Reflective, remember, it can be a little tricky because when they're listening, they might look disengaged, but when they speak, they'll speak with confidence. Yeah. It's the language that gives it away, the I statements, the references to the past. So if we know someone is highly reflective in their listening, we've got a prospect that we know is highly reflective, we want to make sure that we speak to their personal experience. We want to tie our offering, for example, to how it impacts them in their day-to-day, what matters to them. So those are the types of questions that we want to be asking them, really to get connected to what they personally experience and need to accomplish in their job. So here's another one. What do you think?
Go ahead, use the chat. There it is.
Exactly, analytical. So here's the thing. For our highly analytical buyers, the pressure's off a little bit in some ways. So we don't have to really worry as much about connecting on a relational, personal level. Really, what we need to share is the metrics, the data that proves efficacy, right?
Yeah.
It has to make sense, and the metrics have to be there to support it. If we can provide that, then it's very likely we'll get the sale. Right? So you want to make sure for highly analytical listeners that we're not starting with, how was your weekend? Tell me about your kids.
Yeah.
That kind of thing, because that's not what they are listening for. You might be able to get there later, but you want to start with what is and why it works, how it's proven, and have the sources to back it up. Research. Right? So finally, yeah. So I know that right? There was only one left. So yes, this is our conceptual listener that's still ideating when a course of action has been chosen. It's about potentiality, options. So these word choices around, what if, maybe, for conceptual listeners who are our prospects, we want to engage them in the process by encouraging their fresh thinking and ideation to see how our offering could open up possibilities and untapped opportunities for them. So we want to encourage them. What do you see?
Yeah. ...
Potentially, what could, if you were to, so we want to engage them in that process to allow for fresh thinking. The worst thing that we could ever say to someone who's highly conceptual is, this is the way it is. We're not going to change it. We've always done it this way. We don't need to talk about it. So nicely done on those examples. As we wrap up, because we're getting to the close of our time together, I just want to revisit this concept of listening intelligence as a practical model or framework for any conversation. Okay. So here's the reminder. The final piece of this is agility. It's malleability. This is where that comes into play. This is the end goal. The profile or the assessment result is where we start in terms of self-awareness. And we take that and we learn something from it that we can apply, but ultimately being able to adjust on the spot to the conversational needs of others is the end goal. To be able to adapt what we say in order to be able to be heard in the way that we intend. It doesn't mean compromising what's important to us or compromising our message, but it means shifting how we deliver it in order to support our audience and allow them the greatest chance for understanding it completely. So here's something to consider. When people don't get it or they don't understand us, what do we typically do? The first place we go is we often blame them. They're not listening. But there's this mutual responsibility in conversation, and we have to take responsibility for our part as the speaker in being understood. It's not just about them. They're not listening. They don't get it. The onus is on us to be heard, to speak in a way that connects with our listener, right? That means sometimes we have to shift the way that we speak, and we have to speak into their listening. That's why this last piece, this adapting, is so important. Self-awareness, it's critical. But we also have to be able to put it into practical application. All right. So here's where I want you to think back to that first question that I asked you, specifically about scenarios where you find yourself most challenged. The topic, the context, the people that are involved. So think about those people. What do you think their habits are? All right. You think about that. Now, if you've taken the assessment, you can go to pages 6 and 7 and use this as a reference tool. It's how your profile tends to work with others. So if you've got that boss that you just butt heads with, if you think about, well, what is their primary habit? What do I think that is? Okay, now you can take pages 6 and 7 and look at suggestions to put into play to practice for improving conversational outcomes with that individual, right? The next page, page 8, is some general suggestions you can immediately put into practice. So these are pages that you can use for actionable insight to shift how you show up in the most challenging communication scenarios for yourself. Okay. So given that, let's wrap up. Yeah. Here's what I'm going to leave you with. The best, this was what I truly believe. The best sales professionals are the best listeners. Why? Because they connect with their buyers. They speak to what's important to their buyers. They don't spew irrelevant information. They don't pitch. They ask really great questions, and then they speak to what they hear. They are malleable and they can adjust. They are present and focused, and they limit distractions. The secret to asking really good questions, I'm going to re-emphasize this. It's listening. If you're really tuned in and you're listening, that inspires great questions. Okay. So earlier in this training, or in the time that we had together, I mentioned that we tend to speak in the same way that we prefer to listen. So my intention has been, or I should say it differently. The intention of the training is to bring this concept of shifting away from our own needs in the sales conversation, meeting a quota, for example, and practice connecting to what's important to that other individual, to show up so genuinely curious that we ask great questions that are inspired by listening. Right? So I'm going to encourage and also challenge you to connect on a deep enough level that you can shift the way you share information by speaking into their preferences based on what you observe. Okay? What's important to them, so that the sale is just the natural, organic outcome of the conversation.
It's powerful.
So that is what I have for you. So I don't know if we have time for a Q&A or not.
We're going to make time, and we have till 3. David and I can trim our live piece of the podcast as short as we need. Allison, I want to ask a couple of questions came in.
Yeah.
First and foremost, would you bump a conversation out or reschedule if you can tell that the person is completely distracted or not engaged?
So that's a really good question. When you say because you can tell that they're distracted or disengaged, I would say, well, what is that based on? Is that your perception because you're highly connective and you're not observing connective body language from that prospect, so you are perceiving that they're distracted? Or is it truly they've got something going on that is chaos or a fire they need to put out? So I think to answer that question in the most valuable way, I'd say, one, like, is it perception or is it reality? What is it that's giving you clues or cues that they're distracted and not being able to be present.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
I really do actually like to start almost every conversation, meeting, sales-oriented conversation with asking almost the same question, right? Which is, in this time together that we have, what is it that you want to walk away with that makes this time really valuable for you? Okay. What is it that you want to take away specifically from our time together that means it was time well spent? The word choices and what someone answers to that question can often give you a really good identifiable way of knowing their preferences and what they care about. Right? It allows us to speak to that first and foremost versus what we believe or perceive is important.
Yeah. It's great.
Allison, when you're meeting with a group of folks, and you go through that, you're going to get a lot of different answers. And I don't know, with the variation, I mean, you want to hit all of them. You probably are touching upon all of the styles, more dominant. So, is there a time not to ask that, not to enter that? There's 20 people, like we can't really solve.
If you're presenting, David, if you are giving a talk, for example, right, we're not going to ask that question, and it's likely you've prepared something. Right? Sure. If you know you have a diverse audience, you don't exactly know the makeup, but you know it's going to be a diverse audience. The first people you are going to lose are your analytical listeners.
And you and I talked about that. The rest will hang in there. So I'm wondering, after our conversation, because if it's a pricing presentation, your analytical people want to get right to the pricing, would a well planned out, thought out agenda keep them at bay a little bit, so that they know where you're going and they can see, but you and I did talk about that very thing, that you will lose your analytical listeners quickly if they don't, but your connective ones will hang out there almost, till the bitter end. Conceptual,
they're going to give you the most grace. Mm-hmm. They're going to give you the most grace, certainly. But you notice how in this presentation, I started at almost the very beginning of the presentation with some statistics.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if I don't, and I just tell a story, it's very likely that I'm going to lose my analytical listeners. They want the information to be grounded in truth.
Mm-hmm.
And if I give them that, you give them that, right, with a reputable source, then it's a lot more likely that they will hang in there with you. And if you don't give them that, they might just check out from the get-go.
Yeah.
Right.
Perfect.
Yeah. That's great. I like what you said about an agenda. And I think one thing I had to learn in leading groups, not necessarily speaking to a large group in the keynote setting, but when I'm leading a team through a training, or it's a conference room full, going over the housekeeping, getting that done. Here's what we're going to be doing. Then we're going to come to this. It really does help all the people. Now, people are in the room are like, okay, great, let's get to it. But the analyticals are like, thank you. You tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. So some of those things are important when you're seeking to understand that you have a lot of people within an organization who they are the workers. They're the people who get it done. They have a lot of the questions as far as how is this going to? So I think that intelligence and going in and having a well laid out agenda when we're going to get to this, or understand that there's people who would check out if I don't explain when we're going to get to this or that, or I'm going to go 10 minutes into some of the why here, but we're going to tie it back to this so they know, okay, that's coming. That's wise. But I love what you said too. Even with a big keynote, and a lot of people listening here, you do presentations to real estate agents at associations and whatnot. If you have a planner, a training coordinator, or a event planner who's actually bringing you in to speak, one of the best things I've learned to do through coaches, people like Allison and others in my life, is talk to that meeting planner. What was your last event like? What went well? What didn't? What was the highest rated speaker? What did they do? And what you can understand is, because those associations usually pull the same types of people in year after year. So what you can understand is sometimes you get the feedback forms. I've actually seen feedback forms because I asked for them. And it was interesting to see some of the surveys of what they preferred in a speaker, especially if an attorney, or if you're you're going over a lot of legalese stuff, maybe mixing a story in, or doing something that's the human side, or else you will show up and unfortunately you'll get the rating of, this was dry, it was not engaging. And you see a lot of that. So maybe just asking for those things to that one person who's putting you in front of 100 people would be awesome. Would be a thought. So
yeah. There's another question that I get frequently, which is, well, what if I'm in conversation with someone and I can't tell what their listening preferences are? In a situation like that, I'll actually ask someone how they prefer to receive information at times. Literally, I will say to someone, okay, so, when I'm sharing this information with you, do you want me to start with big picture and a little bit more abstract? Or do you want me to get right down into the details or the metrics? Do you prefer that I tie this to your individual role inside of the company and what you need to accomplish? So I'll literally ask them, how do you want me to share information with you to make this conversation the most comfortable and easiest for you to stay engaged with? I don't ask them that last part of the conversation, the last part of that question. But in general, if I'm stumped and I can't tell, that can sometimes give us some structure or some boundary to how we share information. Mm-hmm.
I like the last part of that. The part that you were going to cut out.
That's great. I interjected excitedly there because I'm a conceptual listener, but also because David and I have a friend, Justin Cook. We call it the Cook method because years ago Justin said about sales, if I don't know, I ask. It's literally that. So we call it the Cook method. But listen, if you don't know something, just ask, and you can ask in a really fun way. And Alice, when I found those questions that you ask because you just don't know, it makes people feel so seen. It makes people feel so appreciated. When you just ask them, what do you prefer? It's
really respectful.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Last question, and you don't have to dig deep, but I'm just curious, and this is just more maybe a general thought, but somebody did text me and ask me about it. Does any of this, or do you guys, or has Echo taken into account, and I know it's everyone likes to say, oh, I'm ADD, or I check out because I'm have you taken into account any, and I don't want to call them disorders, but being autistic or being ADD or any of that? How does that play into this?
Yeah, so great question. So there is no science that correlates any kind of neurodiversity with listening habits at this point or to date. What I will share is that there are types of listeners who will often self-diagnose as ADD, and then they say, oh, well, this profile makes sense for me because I swear I'm ADD. But there is no research or data that connects specific profiles or habits with anything on the spectrum of neurodiversity. But it's a great question. I get it frequently.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Allison. Again, thank you for taking your valuable time and investing it with us. What I will say is this will be up on the YouTube platform, and in the description, we're going to share some of what's on the screen here. But Allison, why don't you, in wrapping, just share what is on the screen and how people can get in touch and take this assessment and get paired with somebody from your team?
Yeah. So, if folks haven't taken the assessment yet, or want to bring this back, share this information, insight with someone, please, Tim and David, give folks my email address, or we can throw that into the chat. And, if you're interested in doing this inside of your organization, let's talk about that. If you typically, to take the assessment, and have a debrief with a certified practitioner, or coaching session, typically that's $175. If they want to share this information with someone outside of your organization and do that, they can absolutely use this link or the QR code and go that route. But I highly encourage folks, if this is something that you're really interested in bringing into your company, you want more insight, I'm going to throw my information in the chat here. And so just reach out if you have questions about your profile, and want some insights or interpretation. Absolutely. Let's connect.
Great. And I will say just a plug here is, after I took mine, we got on, we talked for a little while. You shared some ideas and some strategies in how I could be a better conversational partner. And we were talking specifically about, in my marriage and relationship personally, and how I can be more supportive and a better listener. And what I found was I interrupt more often than I would like to admit, because I get a great idea based on what's being said, and boom, and David can attest to this. We've been together for 10 years. I'm conceptualizing.
Not married.
So no, not married. Almost, but no. So one thing you chat, and again, this is just how practical it will be to Zoom in with Allison. So before we let you go, Zoom in, take the assessment and Zoom in, because one of the things that stood out that I took out of our coaching session or whatever it was, jot that down, just real quick. Jot down a note or bite the tongue and just make a mental note if you're in a formal business conversation setting. But and then if it still is important at the end, bring it back. A lot of times it's not important at the end, because again, my brain was going, and you just bring it back, bite the tongue, listen for the end, jot it down, bring it up later. I've done this now, Allison, since we've talked hundreds of times. I did it in your conversation earlier as you're getting through a lot of information. I wanted to interrupt 3 or 4 times because boom, I got this great idea, but I wrote it down. And at the end, one of those things came back. So it's really helped me personally. It's helped me professionally. And it's really helped me to have that insight and that awareness. So, and I also like that you broke it down into 3 things: understand who you are, right? And then I forgot the R already.
Recognize others.
The signals.
Connect
and then
to others.
Adapt. And then adapt. And I think the agility is the key word here. So again, I just huge round of applause. So thank you for joining us.
And having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, David, we're going to wrap up here for a few minutes. And
can I ask a practical question?
Yes.
I know you guys are going to keep doing your thing. If I leave, I don't want to end the meeting because I think I'm a co-host. So I think
let's see. I think I can actually remove or move you over into the attendee, or remove as co-host. So I'll do that real quick.
I would hate to end your call.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Take care, Allison.
Thank you. Happy Friday the 13th.
Happy Friday. Happy Friday. All right. So David, I know. Wow, powerful. What would you say and kick us off, get us into the conversation on sales conversations going deeper?
Well, first of all, I mean, just spending time with Allison is just a treat. It just gets deeper and deeper. I do think for those taking it into your organization or into those that you work with very closely, it's super important. I read Tim read mine, and it helps, the further understanding. But one of the things we wanted to talk about today, and